Listen carefully, because what I'm about to say will challenge everything you've ever believed about money. Money is not a master, it's a servant. And until your faith gives it an assignment, it will serve another man's vision. You were never designed to chase wealth. Wealth was designed to respond to divine instruction. The world may call it luck, but heaven calls it law, the law of faith. Faith doesn't wait for a paycheck. Faith creates the opportunity that makes the paycheck possible. And when your faith is properly positioned in the kingdom system, money has no choice but to obey your command. When faith commands wealth, everything changes. You see, most people are busy trying to make money move, but few have ever learned how to make money obey. Money doesn't respond to effort alone, it responds to authority. And faith, true, living kingdom faith, carries that authority. The moment you understand that faith is heaven's governing currency, you stop chasing things and things start chasing you. Because faith is not belief in your mind. Faith is law in motion. It's heaven's language. It's the invisible force that tells creation what to produce, when to produce, and for whom to produce. When you operate by faith, you enter the same system that God Himself used to form the universe. A system where words are not just sounds, but transactions. Let me ask you, what is money? Is it paper? Is it metal? No. Money is simply a symbol of trust, faith in a government, faith in a promise, faith that what you hold has value. If the world understands that principle in the natural, how much more should we understand it in the spiritual? When you trade in heaven's economy, your belief becomes the currency and your obedience becomes the receipt. That's why many people work hard, but still struggle. They live in the visible economy and ignore the invisible one. They've mastered labor, but not faith. They've studied business, but not belief. You can build a company, but if your faith isn't built, your foundation will crack when pressure comes. But when faith commands, wealth obeys. Because faith doesn't operate by sight, it operates by decree. God never said, work for the blessing. He said, believe the blessing. The blessing is already spoken, but it's your faith that activates its release. Faith is not begging heaven to move, it's giving heaven permission to manifest what already exists. The money you need, the opportunity you're waiting for, the breakthrough you've been praying about, they're already in the system, waiting for faith to call them by name. Think about it. When Peter needed money, Jesus didn't give him a coin. He gave him an instruction. Go to the sea, cast your hook, and the first fish you catch will have what you need. The miracle wasn't in the fish. It was in Peter's obedience to faith's command. Faith gave the order and creation responded. That's heaven's economic model. Faith speaks and the natural world aligns. So the question is not, do you have faith? The question is, does your faith have a voice? Because silent faith produces silent results. You must learn to command your environment, not from arrogance, but from alignment. When you stand in alignment with divine principles, money cannot resist your instruction. It must bow to faith's authority. Because when faith commands wealth, heaven releases the signal and earth responds. And that's where the next mystery unfolds. What happens when you start to deposit your faith into heaven's bank and begin to withdraw prosperity from divine storage? The currency of belief, that's what faith truly is. You see, in heaven's economy, faith is not a feeling, not a hope, not even an emotion. It's currency. It's what you spend to access the promises of God. Just as you cannot buy without money in the natural world, you cannot receive without faith in the spiritual realm. Faith is heaven's medium of exchange. It's how transactions take place between the invisible and the visible. But here's the mystery. Most people believe in God, yet never learn how to believe like God. The difference is massive. Believing in God acknowledges His existence. but believing like God activates his power. God believed and spoke, and creation appeared. You believe and speak, and provision manifests. Do you see the pattern? Creation doesn't respond to need, it responds to faith. That's why some pray endlessly, but see nothing shift, because prayer without belief is just sound. The spiritual realm doesn't move by sound alone, it moves by faith-filled sound. The power is not in the words you say, but in the conviction behind them. When your belief carries authority, your voice becomes the currency heaven recognizes. Think of it this way. Every time you declare something in faith, you are making a deposit into your heavenly account. Every word of doubt withdraws from it. Every act of trust adds to it. You can't expect to live wealthy in the spirit when your faith account is bankrupt. You must learn to invest belief daily, to sow trust continually, to let every action, every thought, every confession carry value in heaven's system. When you begin to understand that belief itself has purchasing power, your posture changes. You stop pleading and you start positioning. You stop worrying about who will bless you, and you start preparing for what heaven has already assigned to you. Because the wealth of heaven doesn't flow to those who wish. It flows to those who believe. Remember this, money in the earth is limited, but belief is limitless. You can lose a job, but you cannot lose belief unless you surrender it. You can lose a business, but faith can birth 10 more. Because faith doesn't rely on what's in your hand. It relies on what's in God's plan. Faith can turn a desert into a river, a famine into a feast, a closed door into an open gate. So the question is not, can God bless me? The question is, can my belief handle what I'm asking for? Because heaven releases only what faith can carry. Your belief is the vessel, and if the vessel is too small, the blessing must wait. That's why sometimes God delays, not because he said no, but because your belief hasn't grown big enough to receive the yes. And when your belief matures into authority, you begin to speak to things, not about them. You begin to command resources, not chase them. You begin to live as a steward of heaven's wealth, not a slave to earth's economy. Because once you understand that faith is currency, you'll learn where that currency is stored, how it multiplies, and how to make divine deposits that produce supernatural withdrawals. Heaven's banking system, it's real, it's alive, and it's operating even now. You see, just as the earth has banks that hold, measure, and release resources, heaven too has a system, one that receives faith as its deposit and returns prosperity as its dividend. But here's the difference. Earth's system runs on interest, heaven's runs on trust. Earth's system can collapse, but heaven's economy is eternal. It never defaults, never delays, never denies what is rightfully secured by faith. Now listen carefully. Every act of obedience you perform, every seed you sow, every word you speak in faith, they are not forgotten. They are recorded. Heaven keeps accounts. You may not see the balance, but it is growing. Every time you trust God when logic says otherwise, that's a deposit. Every time you choose gratitude over complaint, that's another. Every time you act on divine instruction, heaven writes it down in your favor. That's why some people seem to prosper effortlessly, not because they are lucky, but because they've made consistent deposits into heaven's bank. They have built a history of faith transactions, and now the system is responding to their voice. You see, you cannot withdraw from a place where you have made no deposit. You can't expect heaven to release what faith never authorized. And here's the principle. Heaven does not pay on emotion, it pays on faith. It doesn't respond to tears, it responds to trust. That's why some cry for years, but nothing changes, while others speak once in faith and see miracles unfold. It's not favoritism, it's principle. The system only recognizes faith-backed currency. So the question becomes, what have you been depositing? Have your words been seeds of faith or withdrawals of doubt? Have your decisions been guided by conviction or controlled by fear? Every moment you either build your heavenly balance or deplete it. You are constantly transacting in the invisible realm, and when the timing comes, heaven releases the return. But listen, your withdrawal doesn't always appear as money. Sometimes it comes as favor, sometimes as opportunity, sometimes as divine connection. Sometimes it comes as peace in the middle of pressure. Because heaven's prosperity is bigger than paper. It's the fullness of provision in every dimension of your life. When Peter cast his net at the word of the Master, he wasn't fishing. He was withdrawing from his account. When the widow gave her last meal, she wasn't losing. She was making an eternal deposit. And when the boy offered his lunch of bread and fish, heaven multiplied his faith and fed thousands. That's the system. Heaven takes your little, breathes on it, and returns it in overflow. So don't ever think your faith has gone unnoticed. Every step, every prayer, every act of obedience is being stored, multiplied, and prepared for manifestation. But here's where it gets deeper. Because once you understand heaven's banking system, you begin to realize that your seed is not just a gift, it's an investment. And that's where the next revelation unfolds, how your seed begins to speak louder than your salary. Divine economics, now that's a system the world can't explain, yet it governs everything heaven releases. You see, the world says your income determines your outcome, but in God's economy, your faith determines your flow. Earth's system runs on wages. Heaven's runs on seed. And that's why so many people work tirelessly and still feel empty, while others walk in abundance with peace, because they've learned that in the kingdom, your seed speaks louder than your salary. A salary is limited by hours, effort, and human approval. But a seed is only limited by faith. A salary may end when the job ends, but a seed continues to speak long after you've released it. Every time you sow, heaven hears a voice, not the sound of coins, but the sound of belief. The seed says, I trust the invisible more than the visible. I trust the promise more than the paycheck. Now, let me ask you something. When was the last time you allowed your seed to talk for you? Because your seed carries your voice in the spirit. When you give, you're not losing something, you're activating something. You're releasing faith into motion. And faith in motion is irresistible to heaven's economy. That's why giving isn't about money. It's about authority. It's a declaration that your trust is not in what you earn, but in who you serve. Think about it. When Elijah stood before the widow of Zarephath, she had almost nothing left. But she was holding a seed, a small meal, a little oil, and a choice to feed herself and die, or to sow in obedience and live. And when she released it, heaven responded instantly. The barrel never emptied, the oil never ran dry, and her future was preserved. Why? Because faith gave her seed a voice. You see, divine economics doesn't make sense. It makes faith. In this system, loss becomes multiplication, and surrender becomes strategy. You don't give to get, you give because you understand how heaven moves. Every act of giving is an act of governing. You're managing kingdom resources on earth. And when heaven sees you can be trusted with the little, it assigns you the much. So while others measure wealth by what they keep, you measure it by what you release. Because what you release doesn't leave your life. It leaves your hand and enters your future. The seed that leaves today becomes the harvest that finds you tomorrow. That's why divine economics can't be taught by Wall Street or measured by profit margins. It operates by principle, not pressure, by revelation, not reasoning. When your seed begins to speak louder than your salary, you stop chasing provision and start attracting it. Doors open without explanation. Favor finds you without effort, because heaven recognizes your investment and responds with overflow. But here's where it gets even more profound. When you understand that your seed carries divine potential, you begin to see it as capital, spiritual capital that allows you to trade in heaven's market. And that's where the next mystery begins to unfold. Faith as capital now, that's the language of heaven's market. You see, in the kingdom, faith is not just belief, it's value. It's your purchasing power in the unseen realm. Just as investors use money to trade in earth's economy, heaven requires faith to transact in its divine system. Nothing moves until faith is invested. Nothing multiplies until faith is placed into circulation. But here's the challenge. Many people are trying to withdraw from a market they've never traded in. They expect returns without making deposits of trust, obedience, or sacrifice. Faith is not theory, it's currency. And just like in the natural world, unused currency loses influence. Faith must be activated, not stored. It must be traded, not hidden. The moment you act on what you believe, your faith gains interest in the eyes of heaven. That's why miracles don't happen because God decides. They happen because faith trades. Faith is the exchange rate between the natural and the supernatural. It's what converts spiritual promise into tangible provision. When you give faith, heaven releases resources. When you withhold it, heaven holds its response. Everything in the kingdom operates by this divine transaction. Do you remember the parable of the talents? One man buried his gift. The others multiplied theirs. The difference wasn't opportunity. It was faith. Faith takes risk on what it believes. Fear buries what it cannot control. The man who hid his talent was like many believers today, praying for increase while sitting on unused capital. But heaven rewards investors, not hoarders. The currency of faith grows only when it's circulated. Think about it. Every act of obedience is a trade. When Abraham left his homeland, he invested faith and received nations. When Moses stretched his rod, he traded faith and divided seas. When the woman with the issue of blood reached out to touch the hem of his garment, she didn't just touch fabric. She traded faith for healing. Each of them entered heaven's market with their belief as capital, and they came out with divine profit. So, the question is not, do you have faith? The question is your faith in circulation? Because stagnant faith is like buried treasure, valuable but useless. Faith grows when it's risked. It increases when it's exercised. Every challenge you face is an opportunity to invest faith and receive revelation. Every instruction from God is an opening bell in heaven's market. And here's the beauty. The more you trade by faith, the richer you become in spiritual equity. Heaven begins to trust you with larger assignments, greater influence, deeper insight, and supernatural access. You no longer live from paycheck to paycheck. You live from principle to provision. Because when faith becomes your capital, you're no longer at the mercy of the world's economy. You're operating in heaven's exchange. And that's where the next secret unfolds, the law of spiritual investment. How to turn invisible faith into visible wealth. The law of spiritual investment, a principle so powerful, yet so misunderstood. You see, in heaven's economy, nothing leaves your life without multiplying. Every seed of faith, every act of obedience, every word of trust, it's not lost, it's planted. The kingdom doesn't work by chance, it works by law. And that law says, whatever is sown in faith must return in increase. Not sometimes, not maybe, always. Because heaven never forgets what was invested through belief. Now listen carefully. In the world system, investment is risky. You might win, you might lose. But in heaven's system, there's only one condition, the motive behind your investment. Heaven doesn't respond to manipulation, it responds to intention. When your heart aligns with divine purpose, your investment becomes unstoppable. You don't give to get, you give because you know who you're dealing with. The one who multiplies time, talent, and treasure according to faith's measure. Every time you obey a divine instruction, you're investing spiritually. You're placing faith into circulation. The return might not show up in your wallet immediately, but it will show up in your world in favor, in health, in peace, in open doors you didn't even know existed. Because the law of spiritual investment doesn't pay in one currency. It pays in every form of abundance that heaven authorizes. Think about it. When the farmer plants a seed, he doesn't cry over the dirt. He celebrates the process. He knows that even though the ground looks silent, something powerful is happening beneath the surface. Your faith works the same way. What you sow in silence will one day speak in manifestation. You may not see movement, but the system is already responding. The soil of the Spirit never rejects a seed of faith. That's why the most dangerous thing you can do in times of lack is stop sowing. Because when you stop sowing, you stop multiplying. The kingdom doesn't grow through hoarding, it grows through release. The more you release, the greater your harvest becomes. That's not loss, that's divine strategy. You cannot outgive a limitless God, and you cannot out-invest the system he designed. So the question isn't whether heaven will return what you've sown. The question is, can you wait long enough to see the full return? Because patience is part of the investment. The harvest doesn't come to the anxious, it comes to the consistent. Every time you hold on to faith in the dark, you're watering your seed. Every time you speak life when it looks impossible, you're fertilizing your investment. The law of spiritual investment guarantees that no act of faith ever dies. It grows, it expands, and it returns multiplied. You might not know when, you might not know how, but the return is already in motion. And when you understand this law, you'll see that every act of giving, every sacrifice, every moment of obedience is a trade, a spiritual exchange that transforms invisible faith into visible wealth. But here's where it gets deeper still. What happens when you realize that earth's money itself was designed to obey heaven's principles, and that your faith can make money bow to divine command? Why does earth's money answer to heaven's principles? Because everything created on earth was designed to serve heaven's order. You see, money is not a master, it's a mirror. It reflects the system that governs it. And when heaven's laws are applied, the very thing people chase begins to chase you. Money was never meant to rule man. Man was created to rule money. But only through divine alignment can that authority be restored. Now listen carefully. Money moves by faith, not by fear. The world uses fear to control money, fear of loss, fear of lack, fear of tomorrow. But heaven uses faith to command it. Faith says, I don't depend on the system depends on me. That's the shift that separates those who survive from those who thrive. Because when you operate by heaven's principles, you stop reacting to economic changes and start creating them. Every currency on earth, every system of trade, every structure of wealth, all of it originated from a divine concept, stewardship. The first economy was not man's invention, it was heaven's idea. God gave Adam dominion, not ownership. That means everything under your care is waiting for your instruction, not your insecurity. Money obeys voice. It obeys authority. It obeys alignment. That's why those who understand purpose never struggle with provision, because purpose is heaven's invitation for resources to move. But here's the truth. Money doesn't flow where there's chaos. It flows where there's order. Heaven's economy responds to structure. That's why the tithe, the seed, and the offering aren't religious rituals. They're spiritual strategies. They align you with divine order so heaven can legally release abundance. You don't give because God needs it. You give because the act itself resets your authority. Giving dethrones greed. It reclaims your position over possessions. When you learn to operate by heaven's principles, you'll notice something strange. You'll stop chasing opportunities, and opportunities will start finding you. You'll walk into rooms where favor was already waiting. You'll speak one word and resources will rearrange themselves to fulfill your instruction. Because heaven doesn't release wealth to need, it releases it to assignment. And where there is faith, there is divine endorsement. So the question is, are you managing money, or is money managing you? Because the proof of mastery is not in how much you earn, but in how freely you can release what you have. When you hold too tightly, you confess that money owns you. But when you give boldly, you prove that heaven rules through you. That's when earth's money begins to obey. And once you understand this, once you grasp that divine principles govern even the flow of earthly wealth, you realize something greater is hidden beneath the surface. Because beyond obedience, beyond giving, beyond sowing, there's an invisible account that holds the record of every act of faith, every seed sown, every word spoken. And that's where the next mystery unfolds. The invisible account, how God stores and multiplies what you believe. The invisible account, yes, it's real. You may not see it, but it's operating behind the scenes of your life right now. Every act of faith, every word spoken in belief, every seed sown in obedience, they're not lost, they're recorded. Heaven has a banking system that never forgets. And just like the earth keeps track of financial transactions, heaven keeps track of faith transactions. Nothing escapes the record of the divine economy. You see, when you pray in faith, heaven makes a note. When you give in faith, heaven makes a deposit. When you endure trials without losing your trust, heaven increases your balance. There are spiritual ledgers written in your name, not of your failures, but of your faithfulness. That's why some blessings don't appear instantly. They're not denied, they're stored. Stored until the fullness of time, stored until the conditions align, stored until your capacity matches your request. And here's the mystery. Your invisible account is growing even when you don't feel it. Every moment you choose trust over fear, you're adding credit. Every time you forgive when it hurts, heaven counts it as currency. Every time you obey when it's uncomfortable, you're funding your future. The system is perfect. It multiplies faith far more than money ever could. But listen carefully. Withdrawals require maturity. Heaven doesn't release what you can't yet manage. The Father doesn't give abundance to those still bound by anxiety, because the purpose of the blessing is not to consume, but to confirm your stewardship. That's why sometimes you'll sense delay, not because heaven is withholding, but because it's preparing you to carry what's already yours. The widow who gave her last coin didn't know she was making a deposit. The man who sowed in famine didn't realize he was opening a spiritual account that would feed nations. And when you give, when you obey, when you trust, you're doing more than surviving. You're building an invisible portfolio of faith that heaven will eventually turn into visible manifestation. So, the question is not whether God has heard you. He has. The real question is, what's the balance in your invisible account? Have you been making deposits through consistency or withdrawals through complaint? Because faith builds, but doubt depletes. The wise investor keeps sowing, keeps believing, keeps speaking life, even when the statement looks empty, because they know the account is active and heaven's return is always multiplied. And when that appointed time arrives, when your spiritual balance matures, heaven issues a withdrawal slip with your name on it. Suddenly, what was invisible becomes tangible. What was promised becomes present, because heaven never forgets faith that was sown. But here's the next dimension. When you begin to understand how your invisible account operates, you realize that faith doesn't just produce provision, it produces governance. And that's when you enter the higher realm of the faith economy, where money, opportunity, and resources no longer control you, but obey the command of your belief. The faith economy, that's the highest level of divine financial intelligence. It's where money no longer governs you, you govern it. It's where faith stops being a concept and becomes a commanding force. You see, the world trades with currency that fluctuates, that devalues, that fears inflation. But heaven trades with a currency that never loses power, faith. And when you begin to understand that, you stop living by the limits of your bank account and start living by the abundance of your belief. In the faith economy, everything obeys divine principle. Doors open not because of connections, but because of conviction. Opportunities align, not because of luck, but because of law. When you walk in faith, you are walking in spiritual legislation. Heaven recognizes your authority, and earth responds to your decree. That's why faith isn't emotional, it's governmental. It governs outcomes. It commands increase. It shifts atmospheres. The faith economy doesn't ask, what do I have? It asks, what do I believe? Because in heaven's system, possession follows perception. You must see it before you can hold it. You must speak it before it appears. Every word of faith is a transaction. Every declaration is a spiritual investment that changes your reality. When faith moves, heaven's warehouse opens and earth receives shipment. That's how the invisible becomes visible. Now listen carefully. Faith doesn't chase things, it creates them. Faith doesn't beg, it legislates. It speaks to storms and they calm. It speaks to mountains and they move. It speaks to lack and it multiplies. Because faith doesn't operate from earth to heaven. It operates from heaven through you. You are heaven's distribution channel, assigned to manifest divine provision on earth. When you know that, you no longer panic when things look empty, because you know the source never runs dry. That's why the world can't understand believers who prosper without explanation. They look at you and see no logical reason, but they can't see your faith economy working behind the scenes. They don't see your invisible account, your obedience, your seed, your trust, all of which have been trading in heaven's system, yielding returns the world cannot calculate. So let me ask you, are you living by faith or are you living by figures? Are you reacting to the economy or are you commanding it through divine principle? Because when faith becomes your economy, lack loses its voice and wealth becomes your servant. And now hear this final truth of faith is the only currency that never crashes. Faith is the only investment that never expires. Faith is the only economy untouched by recession. Faith is the voice that calls provision from the unseen. Faith is the key that unlocks heaven's abundance. Faith is the law that makes money bow. And when faith becomes your economy, earth itself will respond to your belief.